Dame Rosie, I rise to support new Clause 3 and Amendment 7, and as mine is the second name on Amendment 7, which is tabled by my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield, who was mainly responsible for it. I think I also incline to the view slightly the better drafted, but I will support either, whichever or both, if they're put to the vote. And I may well succeed in being reasonably short, because I have to say that the Honourable Lady behind Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, the Right Honourable Lady, gave a speech with which I agreed every word of it, and I will not repeat what she said. It was a very welcome note of cross-party consensus. I think exists amongst a large part of this House. I think it represents the cross-party consensus which is in favour of what is usually lazily called a soft Brexit and the best possible close relationship with the European Union after we leave the European Union. The main issue in this debate, it seems to me, turns on what do we mean by a meaningful vote, which of course is our discussion of what actually is the role of parliamentary sovereignty in a situation of this kind. And I quite accept that the Prime Minister has not for the first time risen today and actually promised us a meaningful vote, which she later went on to qualify slightly by talking about the need for statutory instruments to be brought forward during the period of this bill within the extraordinary powers that this bill gives to ministers to enact by regulation even changes to British statute law. So I think we have to be clear what is a meaningful vote. The key thing is the timing. It is quite obvious that if the British government is actually to be responsible to the British Parliament, then the vote has got to take place before the British government has committed itself to the terms of the treaty-like agreement that is entered into with the other members. Any other vote is not meaningful. I'll give way in just a second, but I feel at the point that I'll give way, certainly. This means that a meaningful vote cannot take place until the agreement has been arrived at in detail about the precise nature, certainly of our trading and economic relationships with the single market of the European Union, and actually quite a lot else besides, because we still have to embark on the security discussions, the policing discussions, which agencies we're going to remain in, which agency rules we're going to comply with. This, as we all agree, is a huge and complex agreement which is going to determine the very nature of this country's relationships with the rest of the continent of Europe and actually with the wider world for generations to come. Now, can that happen before March 2019? And I think one difficulty we're all facing, it's a genuine difficulty, is it's quite obvious that we're not going to be remotely near having that agreement by March 2019. And we have to think through what that actually means. I think the negotiators are being very optimistic in saying that they will have firstly a transition deal and then a deal by 2019. I'm sure they will try, but they haven't a chance. And I think what they're actually talking about, certainly the continental negotiators, is they might be able to have some heads of agreement on what the eventual destination is going to be by March 2019, which we will all carefully consider. But they will then certainly have to agree on a transition deal of at least 2 years, within which the rest will have to be completed. And I agree with the Right Honourable Lady, everybody wants for speed, because one of the things this country is suffering from most of all at the moment is the appalling uncertainty caused by the fact we've taken a ridiculous length of time to reach three obvious conclusions on the three preliminary points that had to be determined on the basis of our withdrawal, and we don't at the moment know quite what the British government is going to be seeking as its end role in the negotiations about to start, because the British government has not yet been able to agree within the cabinet on exactly what it's seeking. So it's not a question, I may say to my desperately paranoid Eurosceptic friends, that somehow I am trying in some surreptitious Remainer way to put a spoke in the wheels of the fast progress of the United Kingdom towards the destination to which we're going. But they don't know what leave means. Nobody discussed what leave meant when we were having the referendum. So I think it's a duty, our overriding duty is not just to our political allegiance and so on, our overriding duty is to provide this government with this country with good governance, run in a responsible way, facing up to the problems of the real world, in which the government, accountable to Parliament, produces the best new order it can produce for the benefit of future generations. So I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman is demonstrating why he's Father of the House, so I hesitate to interrupt him, to be honest. But in relation to the point he made about having that meaningful vote prior to the Prime Minister of the day making the deal, with his wealth of experience, does he agree with me that it's very important, if we are to keep the country together, that Prime Minister, when making that agreement, has in the back of her head that I have to get this through my Parliament in order to pull that off?
The honourable gentleman has made one of the points I'd made a one-line note to actually make, because the most important effect on the negotiations of these amendments, if we can carry either of them, and actually the delivery, because there's more to this actually in a meaningful vote, as we all realise, as you look at the various stages. But if we achieve proper parliamentary accountability, it will affect the tenor of the negotiations. Because like every other head of government in the European Union, our Prime Minister, like the other Prime Ministers, will have to have at the back of her mind, can I deliver what I'm thinking of conceding to the House of Commons? Every other political leader in Europe will do that, because every other political leader has got to sell what they sign up to their own Parliament and their own. We would be, if we don't have this, the only member state whose negotiators were not under a legally or constitutionally binding commitment to sell this deal, because they're going to be able to make this deal and then go back to the House of Commons and the House of Lords and say, this is it, and what do you think of it? Let me give way here.
Qualified majority. I'm very grateful to the Father of the House, and he's absolutely right. At the moment, as drafted, the bill essentially gives the government a blank cheque. On this issue of timing, the only thing, and I wonder if he agrees with me, that I have seen in the statement today from the Secretary of State for exiting the EU, the only commitment he has given with regard to what will happen before we leave the European Union is that the proposed withdrawal agreement and implementation bill will be introduced before we leave the European Union. That's clearly unacceptable. Any piece of legislation seeking to do what that bill has in mind has to be passed before we leave the European Union, even if it means extending the process to maintain parliamentary sovereignty.
I agree entirely. This idea, well, my next point is, and it links into this, I'll come back in a second. The nature of the parliamentary approval can't just be a motion or a resolution. It has to have a statutory basis, which is what the Prime Minister has followed. There are various reasons for that, but I mean the most obvious one is the extremely uncertain status of motions of this House in current parliamentary practice. The Secretary of State for Brexit is only the latest, given only the latest example of saying anything else is not legally enforceable. It's a statement of intent. The House of Commons keeps passing all kinds of motions with which I ferociously disagree, but which get carried through this House, giving all kinds of criticisms of what the government's doing. We have moved into a new era where the government is being allowed to keep saying, well, Parliament may pass motions, but they're really worthless expressions of opinion, and they're not anything part of our accountable to the elected body of the House.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Of course, the original plan was not to have a bill and to rely on Clause 9, statutory instruments to effect changes of constitutional significance. And then recently it's been made clear on, I think, the 17th of November that we will in fact have a bill. But doesn't he agree with me to try to make these sorts of changes by secondary legislation just is not? And it's very unlikely the courts would say that a constitutionally significant change of that sort could be made by secondary legislation.
More legal.
Well, again, I agree entirely with my right honourable learned friend. It takes us back to something that's recurred all the way through this process. Now, let me say, I mean, obviously I'm disagreeing with the government. I'm critical of the government in many respects, of both the policy and the way it's being conducted, but I do have some sympathy with the government since the election, because it is trying to carry through this enormous and controversial and historical measure when it hasn't got a parliamentary majority, except it sometimes has, if it can persuade the Democratic Unionist Party to turn up and support them. The result was we had the process started with this extraordinary suggestion that the royal prerogative was going to be invoked, and the whole question of treaty making was not going to involve Parliament at all. It did not require any parliamentary consent to leave. Well, that did have to be taken to court, rather astonishingly. It came to a fairly predictable conclusion. And then, as it has already been said, I just won't repeat what my right honourable friend said. The next slide here was it'll all be done by statutory instruments under broad powers. We are slowly getting to what I would have thought is the fundamental minimum that a real parliamentary democracy should be demanding, which is that this country is not going to be able to enter into a binding treaty commitment until its details have received full parliamentary approval. How we get there is a matter, no doubt, of some difficulty, but it must be addressed. I will in a second. The other thing that's typified the debates on this bill and typifies the government's approach to parliamentary scrutiny, and I do understand their difficulties when they have no majority and they have people like me and the members trying to interrupt me, allegedly on the same side of the House, who fundamentally disagree with each other, and not part of this majority. But I have attended every day of the debates of this bill. And yesterday we spent the day discussing parliamentary scrutiny. And I don't think our proceedings have been a great advertisement for parliamentary scrutiny. The reaction of the government to each and every proposal that's produced and amendment that's produced is to say how carefully they've listened, how important it is, how they will go away and think about it, and then to explain why the drafting of the bill remains as it is and is not currently to be amended. More seriously, I've done that myself. I'll give way in a second, I will. But I've done that myself in taking legislation to the House, I'm sure, many times. It's always a joy to find you can get away with it for quite a long time, because it postpones, and after a bit you get used to the fact that you can just get through as long as you're suitably polite and flattering to those who are moving all the amendments. But the actual reasons that have been given for rejecting the proposals are all administrative convenience. They're obscure drafting amendments. I congratulate the parliamentary draftsman on producing such extraordinary, sort of amazing, minutiae arguments supporting the amazing aspirations of civil servants who see a mountain of work before them and hope that most of it can proceed with the minimum of political scrutiny. What we have not heard, and I'm going to have to hear it today, because that might just judge me, is what are the political arguments against Parliament having a meaningful role? What is the constitutional argument that says Parliament should be denied a statute before all these commitments are entered into the government? I have not heard a word actually so far expressed trying to explain that to me. And I do think that should be the key dominant thought in the government's mind as it negotiates. Of course they have to think what will happen, what will satisfy the Foreign Secretary and the Environment Secretary. Of course they have to get something that the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and the Sun will actually criticise them least for, and so on. But I don't think Parliament is an afterthought to those vital considerations. I think it's the parliamentary process that matters, and the rest is a problem for some press officer to go away and actually deal with. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable and learned friend for giving way. He said earlier that this was something that other parliaments around Europe would get to do, but we couldn't. But that I would posit isn't true, because this is about the withdrawal agreement. That will be agreed under qualified majority voting by the council. So it isn't true to say that every parliament around Europe will get a say on this subject matter.
Right. Qualified majority voting was an excellent innovation achieved by the Thatcher government when we were explaining to the other Europeans how they were going to have an effective free trade agreement. The number of times the British government's ever been outvoted under qualified majority voting is tiny. In these negotiations it could be extremely important. Because otherwise you'll have the government, I don't know, won't name any, they're all friendly states, but some small state will suddenly decide it's got some great lobby group at home that does not want to concede to the British something which the British government has made to achieve, and the whole thing will be held up. It will have to go to all the parliaments. The Parliament of Wallonia will no doubt be allowed to have a say, which if the government has its way, this Parliament won't. Wait a second, I'm answering the question first of all. The Parliament of Wallonia will be allowed to have a say. I'm not sure the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Parliament will. We've only to be seen. The governments will all have to take a view. The governments will have to take a view and defend their view to their own parliaments in each and every case. And we've been the only one not.
Marcus Fish.
I seek your guidance on actually whether this is misleading the House, because it is not. It is simply untrue to say that each Parliament will have a vote.
It's disorderly to say an honourable member is misleading the House, and I suggest that the honourable gentleman settles down and allows the father of the House to continue. Kenneth Clarke.
Qualified majority voting means each government casts a vote. And if you get a qualified majority, that is the effective decision. Each of the ministers who's taken part in that vote is, of course, accountable to their own parliament, to whom they go home and to whom they defend it. And if it's a difficult, controversial thing,
that is the point.
Any sensible minister, all those ministers, will have taken the view of the House before they go and cast their vote on the part of the country. It is utterly ludicrous to say that this Parliament should be denied a vote and not allowed a role because qualified majority voting somehow qualifies that and replaces it. I find, with great respect, he says what I say is untrue. I say his argument is an absurdity.
I thank my right honourable and learned friend for giving way, and I certainly respect his consistency on this issue. He is on public record as having once said that he looks forward to the day when Westminster Parliament will be nothing more than a council chamber of the European Parliament. But can I take this issue with him? Can I make this suggestion to him? And that it is quite clear when he says that Leavers did not know what they were voting for, he does risk sounding very condescending, because we knew exactly what we were voting for. To reclaim our laws, to reclaim our finances. And whilst one accepts his point that one cannot predict the future with detail, in any detail, that is as much true for the EU as it is for this country.
Well, firstly, my honourable friend is not the sort of friend who usually repeats the most scurrilous right-wing rubbish, which fanatic Eurosceptics come on about what I said and had not said in the past. I am not a federalist, and I never have been a federalist, and I do not pursue a United States of Europe. And it really, that is social media stuff to start sort of throwing that kind of thing in when we're having in the middle of a serious parliamentary debate. Secondly, when the public were invited to vote in a referendum, they were, what's the great thing about take back control? Well, that wasn't defined, it was mainly the borders, but then there were 70 million Turks and all the rest of it. They were told in the campaigning that our trade with the United Kingdom would not be affected in any way. Indeed, that is still being held out as a prospect by the Brexit Secretary and others who seem to believe that they're going to get unfettered trade without any of the obligations when they get there. The discussions we've had in this House in the previous days of this debate, the details of what a single market means, what a customs union means, and so on, would have been a mystery to anybody whose knowledge of the subject was confined to the arguments in the national media that appeared on both sides. The arguments reported on both sides were largely rubbish. And it is for this House now to turn to the real world and decide in detail what we do. I'm going to conclude, if I may.
I think we need to give way to
Bill. My notes.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving. Madam Deputy, the Leader of the House is quite right. There will be a qualified majority vote on the withdrawal agreement. Now, the withdrawal agreement doesn't go to each individual parliament in the same way that the actual trade agreement does. And does my right honourable friend and learned friend share the concerns of many people as it now dawns upon them? They had thought this place would have some sort of say about the trade deal, the actual final relationship that we will have with the European Union. But actually, they will have no such say because it will not be finalised until after we have left the European Union. Does he agree that that is now concerning many citizens across the length and breadth of this land who did indeed apparently vote to take back control?
Well, I agree entirely. And my honourable friend, is underlining very eloquently the point which the right honourable lady for Normanton was making, the point which I have been trying to make. We must have a meaningful vote before the final trade deal, indeed the whole deal, is actually agreed by this government. I am going to conclude. Let me try to lower the temperature by going back very, very rarely what I do, which is to, I'm not going to give way, to reminisce for a moment, because I've given way on the same point. I normally give way. I'm
indebted to my right honourable learned friend. If we could just for a moment return to Amendment 7, if I may. My right honourable friend, learned friend, and I believe also my right honourable learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield, both concede that the amendment at this crucial moment in this bill is defective, and it wouldn't work. It would not work for a variety of reasons. Now, does my right honourable friend, having regard to what he said about scrutiny and responsibility and the rest, agree that it's not appropriate to put an amendment of this kind to a vote when in fact it would actually make a nonsense of itself? It would be a meaningless vote about a meaningful vote.
Amend it. Why didn't you amend it, Bill?
Well, no doubt my honourable friend will catch your eye, Dame Rosie, and he was going to explain why he thinks it's technically defective. This is the kind of argument we've had against every proposition that's been put throughout this bill that's been raised. I heard the Prime Minister firstly promises a meaningful vote, and then go on to explain how this bill would have to be used to make statutory instruments, so using the very, very wide powers of this bill, probably before even the end of the Article 90 period. I think that's what she said, and this would prevent that. It would prevent these powers being used until a statute has been passed by this House, confirming this House's approval, and thereby also giving legal effect by that route to whatever final agreement has been arrived. And I bow to my honourable friend's legal skill, and he was indeed in parliamentary law when he practiced, but I cannot for the life of me see why it's defective. I was about briefly to end with a little reminiscing, which I don't do because it's the last thing veterans should do, but obviously I keep being reminded of the 1972 European Communities Act, which is the mirror image of which we are now producing. And I hope the House will forgive me just thinking back a little to think what the reaction of that House of Commons, which was a much more powerful House of Commons than the present one is, what the reaction of that House of Commons would have been if the government of the day had come along with the kind of propositions we keep facing about the role of Parliament in the whole process. The reaction to being told there was going to be no parliamentary vote, it was all a matter of the royal prerogative, would have been unrepeatable, I think, across the House, from Enoch Powell to Michael Foot. The key vote was a vote in principle on the agreement that had been reached. Now, a different thing, because we were applying. The first thing was to get parliamentary approval. No one said it was going to be non-binding. Nobody said it was going to be just a resolution. But there was a very key resolution which determined whether we could go ahead at all, which was some Conservatives voted against, a much bigger number of Labour members voted in favour of, and gave a very satisfactory majority. And then the whole process was subjected to debate in a bill at much greater length, in much greater detail than anything this House of Commons will ever be allowed, before there was the slightest prospect of the British government thinking it was going to be able to ratify that and commit us to member of the European bill. The present situation is a sad contrast to all that in many ways. It comes at a time when there's utmost confusion about what our policy is, as we seek whatever destination we are eventually going to take as we reach this agreement. I think either New Clause 3 or Amendment 7 is the absolute minimum that this House should be passing at this stage to make it quite clear that binding commitments that affect future generations, changing our law in substantial ways, can only be made with the proper approval of both Houses of Parliament, following the full procedures that are necessary for statutory law.
Matthew Pennycook.